I thought I knew everything about my family, until that summer afternoon at the beach shattered everything I believed in. One touch, one moment, and my entire world began to crumble. Freya thought she had it all. A stable life with her husband, Ethan, and their 2 children, Leo and Lily. From the outside, their family seemed perfect. They had a cozy home in the suburbs, regular routines, and memories of laughter that still lingered on the walls. But perfection is often a mask, and behind closed doors, Freya felt like a shadow of herself. Ethan was a hardworking man. His job demanded long hours, leaving little time for his family. Freya understood at first. She admired his dedication to providing for them. But as the years passed, the cracks in their relationship deepened. Conversations became sparse, limited to necessities, bills, schedules, and the children. The spark they once shared had faded into a dim glow, barely noticeable amidst the monotony. Freya's loneliness grew, but she buried it, keeping herself busy with household tasks and caring for her children. Lily, the youngest, brought her moments of joy with her innocence and boundless energy. But Leo, at 16, was a different story. He was quiet, reserved, and spent most of his time in his own world of music and video games. Yet, despite his introversion, there was an unspoken connection between him and Freya, a bond forged in their shared sense of being overlooked. On the morning that everything began to unravel, Ethan left for work without a second glance. Freya stood in the kitchen, watching as he kissed Lily goodbye but barely acknowledged her. "I can't make it today," he said, briefcase in hand, before disappearing out the door. She didn't argue. She hadn't for years. Instead, she turned her focus to Leo, suggesting a spontaneous beach trip. His shrug was indifferent, but he agreed, and soon they were driving toward the coast. Freya tried to make small talk, but the hum of the car and the faint sound of music from Leo's earbuds filled the silence. As they reached the shore, Freya felt the first twinge of something different. The beach was quiet, the waves calm, and the warmth of the sun felt almost inviting. She spread out their towels and turned to Leo, determined to make this day feel meaningful. Little did she know, it would become a day that would haunt her forever. Freya had hoped the beach would provide an escape, a chance to reconnect with her son and find a moment of peace in her otherwise chaotic and lonely life. For the first hour, it seemed to work. The sun's warmth and the rhythm of the waves provided a temporary solace. Leo, though quiet, appeared relaxed, occasionally glancing at his mother as she chatted about mundane topics. But something about the day felt off. Freya couldn't pinpoint it at first. Perhaps it was the absence of Ethan, his usual excuse of work lingering in her mind. She couldn't remember the last time they'd gone anywhere as a family. Every missed holiday, every canceled outing, felt like another weight added to her chest. And now, with Ethan absent once again, she was left to find comfort in her son's presence. As Freya laid on the towel, soaking in the sun, she asked Leo for a small favor, to rub sunscreen on her back. It was a simple request, innocent in her mind, but something shifted in the air. Leo hesitated before kneeling beside her, taking the bottle from her hands. His first touch was tentative, almost shy. Freya smiled, reassured by his care, and told him he could press harder. As his hands moved over her back, Freya felt a warmth she hadn't expected. She told herself it was nothing, just the sun, the salt in the air, the novelty of being cared for, even if it was in a small way. But when his hands lingered just a moment too long, she froze. There was a hesitation, an unspoken question, in the way his fingers paused at the edge of her towel. She turned her head slightly to glance at him. His expression was unreadable, his eyes fixed on the task as if it were the most natural thing in the world. But Freya couldn't ignore the flutter in her chest, the mix of discomfort and something darker that she couldn't name. She wanted to say something to stop him, but the words stuck in her throat. The drive home that day was quiet, both of them lost in their thoughts. Freya replayed the moment over and over, questioning herself, her actions, and the tension she felt between them. At home, she threw herself into routine, cooking dinner, folding laundry, and tucking Lily into bed, all the while avoiding Leo's gaze. But avoidance didn't erase the feeling that something had changed. Over the next few days, Freya began to notice subtle shifts in Leo's behavior. He seemed to find reasons to be near her, brushing against her when passing in the hallway or lingering in the kitchen when she was cooking. She told herself she was imagining things, that this was just a phase, but the unease gnawed at her. Then there were the looks. She'd catch him watching her, his eyes lingering a moment too long. At first, she brushed it off. Teenagers could be moody and distant. But this wasn't the same. His gaze wasn't distant. It was focused, almost intense. It made her heart race in a way that confused and frightened her. Freya began to feel trapped in her own home, the walls closing in as the tension between her and Leo grew. She couldn't talk to Ethan. He barely noticed her anymore, let alone her struggles. And even if she could, how could she explain what she was feeling when she didn't fully understand it herself? The lines of their relationship blurred further with every passing day. Freya knew she needed to take control to create distance, but every time she looked at Leo, she felt a pull she couldn't resist. It was wrong, she knew it was wrong, but the loneliness that had consumed her for so many years whispered otherwise. And so the cracks in their family widened, setting the stage for the storm that was about to come. The days following their trip to the beach were a haze for Freya. Every interaction with Leo felt loaded, as if the air between them had grown heavier, charged with unspoken words and unacknowledged feelings. Freya wanted to chalk it up to her imagination, to convince herself that nothing had changed. But deep down she knew better. Leo's behavior became more attentive, more present. He began offering to help her with tasks he previously avoided, carrying groceries, doing the dishes, or fixing small things around the house. At first, Freya appreciated it, seeing it as a teenager stepping up to lighten her load. But then there were the moments that made her pause. The way his hand lingered on hers when he passed her a dish. The way his gaze followed her as she moved about the kitchen. She would feel his eyes on her back, a sensation that both unnerved and intrigued her. Freya tried to keep herself busy, to push away the growing awareness of her son's presence. She volunteered at Lily's school, organized the linen closet, and even took up a new book club, all in an effort to create distance. But every time she returned home, Leo was there, his quiet presence impossible to ignore. It was a hot Friday afternoon when the tension came to a head. Ethan had called earlier, saying he'd be home late again. Freya barely responded, her usual numbness surfacing at the thought of another evening spent in a house that felt too big and too empty. As she stared at the clock, she turned to Leo and asked, almost impulsively, if he wanted to take a walk to the park nearby. Leo agreed without hesitation, grabbing his shoes and falling into step beside her as they walked down the shaded neighborhood path. The air between them was quiet, the only sounds the crunch of gravel beneath their feet and the occasional chirp of birds overhead. Freya glanced at him, his face calm yet unreadable, and she felt a pang of guilt for the unease that had grown between them. At the park, they found a quiet bench under an oak tree. Freya leaned back, closing her eyes and letting the warm breeze wash over her. For a moment, she felt at peace. But then she felt the bench shift slightly as Leo leaned closer. "Mom," he said softly, breaking the silence. She opened her eyes and turned to him, startled by the intensity in his gaze. "What is it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He hesitated, looking down at his hands before meeting her eyes again. "I feel like you've been avoiding me." Freya's breath caught in her throat. She didn't know how to respond, the weight of his words hitting her harder than she expected. "I haven't been avoiding you," she lied, forcing a small smile. "Things have just been busy." But Leo shook his head, his expression unwavering. "It's more than that. Ever since the beach, things have been different." Freya froze, her heart pounding. She searched for the right words, something to diffuse the situation, but Leo's next statement left her speechless. "I can't stop thinking about it," he said, his voice barely audible. "About you." The world seemed to tilt as Freya processed his words. Her first instinct was to dismiss it, to tell him he was imagining things, that it was just a phase. But instead, she sat there unable to move, unable to speak. Leo reached out, his hand brushing hers. It was a small gesture, but it carried an intensity that left no room for misunderstanding. Freya felt a surge of emotions, guilt, fear, and something darker, something she couldn't name but couldn't deny. "You're my son," she finally whispered, her voice trembling. "I know," Leo replied, his hand still on hers. "But I can't help how I feel. And I don't think you can either." Freya pulled her hand away, standing abruptly. "This isn't right," she said, her voice firmer now. We can't do this." Leo didn't argue. He simply looked at her, his expression a mixture of pain and understanding. Freya turned and began walking back home, her mind racing. She knew she needed to put a stop to whatever was happening, to create distance before it spiraled further out of control. But even as she told herself this, she couldn't shake the warmth of his hand on hers, the way his words had made her heart race. Back at home, Freya retreated to her room, locking the door and sitting on the edge of her bed. She stared at her reflection in the mirror, searching for answers in her own eyes. How had things come to this? How had she allowed the lines to blur so completely? As the evening wore on, the house grew quiet. Ethan's absence loomed large, a reminder of the void in Freya's life that she had tried so hard to ignore. And as much as she hated to admit it, Leo's attention filled that void in a way she hadn't experienced in years. Freya knew she was standing on the edge of a precipice, and one wrong step could destroy everything. But even as she told herself to step back, she felt the pull, drawing her closer to a line she wasn't sure she could resist crossing. The evening was heavy with silence. Freya sat on the couch, pretending to read a book while Lily was upstairs in bed, and Ethan was, as usual, still at work. The house was dimly lit, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the background. Leo sat across the room, scrolling through his phone, but Freya could feel his eyes flicking up to her, watching. She tried to ignore it, to focus on the words in front of her, but they blurred together, meaningless. Eventually, Leo stood and walked toward the kitchen. Freya followed his movements out of the corner of her eye, her pulse quickening for reasons she didn't want to name. When he didn't return after a few minutes, she stood, drawn by some unspoken force, and made her way to the kitchen. She found him leaning against the counter, a glass of water in his hand. He looked up as she entered, his expression unreadable. For a moment they just stood there, the air between them thick with tension. "Can't sleep?" she asked, her voice coming out quieter than she intended. Leo shrugged, setting the glass down. "Just thinking," he said, his tone equally soft. Freya took a step closer, then stopped herself. She folded her arms across her chest, as if the gesture could shield her from whatever was happening. "About what?" she asked. "You," he said, the word hanging in the air like a thunderclap. Freya's breath caught. She looked at him, searching for something, an explanation, a way to make sense of the situation, but all she saw was raw emotion. It was there in his eyes, unguarded and intense, and it scared her as much as it drew her in. "You can't say things like that," she whispered, though her voice lacked conviction. "Why not?" Leo asked, stepping closer. "It's the truth." Freya backed up, her heart pounding as her back hit the counter. "Because it's not right," she said, her voice trembling. "You're my son. This isn't supposed to happen." Leo didn't stop. He closed the distance between them, his gaze locked on hers. "But it is happening," he said, his voice low and steady. "And you feel it too. Don't lie to me, Mom." Freya opened her mouth to protest, to push him away, but the words wouldn't come. She stood frozen as Leo raised a hand, his fingers brushing against her cheek. The touch was gentle, hesitant, as if he were waiting for her to stop him. She didn't. Her mind screamed at her to move, to say something, to do anything to end this. But her body betrayed her, leaning into his touch instead of pulling away. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the reality of the moment, but it only made her more aware of him, his warmth, his closeness, the way his breath tickled her skin. "Leo," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "We can't." But before she could finish, he leaned in and kissed her. It was soft at first, tentative, as if he were testing her reaction. Freya's mind raced, a cacophony of guilt, fear, and something darker that she couldn't name. She knew she should stop him, push him away, tell him this was wrong. But instead, she kissed him back. The kiss deepened, and Freya felt herself slipping, losing control of the boundaries she'd always believed were unshakable. She hated herself for it, for the way her body responded, for the way her heart raced in a way it hadn't in years. And yet, she couldn't stop. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing heavily. Freya stepped back, her hand flying to her mouth as if to erase what had just happened. This can't happen again," she said, her voice shaking. "Do you hear me? It can't." Leo looked at her, his expression a mix of longing and guilt. "I'm sorry," he said, but there was something in his tone that told her he didn't regret it, not really. Freya turned and left the kitchen, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. She climbed the stairs to her bedroom and locked the door behind her, collapsing onto the bed. She stared at the ceiling, her mind replaying the moment over and over. She knew she had crossed a line, one that could never be uncrossed, and it terrified her. The next morning, Freya avoided Leo as much as she could. She busied herself with chores, trying to create a semblance of normalcy. But every time she caught a glimpse of him, her heart skipped a beat. She couldn't look him in the eye, couldn't face the reality of what they had done. But avoidance didn't erase the truth. That evening, when Ethan came home, Freya felt like she was living a double life. She smiled and nodded at his stories about work, cooked dinner, and helped Lily with her homework, all the while feeling Leo's gaze on her. The breaking point came later that night. Ethan had fallen asleep on the couch, and Lily was upstairs in bed. Freya was in the kitchen washing dishes when she felt Leo's presence behind her. She didn't turn around, but her body tensed as she felt him step closer. "Mom," he said softly, his voice like a whisper in the dark. "Don't," she said, her hands gripping the edge of the sink. "Don't do this, Leo." "I can't stop thinking about you," he said, his voice trembling. "I can't stop wanting you." Freya turned around, her eyes filled with tears. "This has to stop," she said, her voice breaking. "Do you understand me? We can't do this." But even as she said the words, she knew they carried no weight. She was too far gone, too tangled in her own emotions to pull herself out. And when Leo reached for her, she didn't push him away. The days that followed were like walking through a storm. Freya felt as though every moment was teetering on the edge of disaster. The guilt weighed on her, crushing her with its relentless grip. She avoided Ethan as much as possible, knowing she couldn't look him in the eye without the fear of him seeing the truth written across her face. With Lily, she maintained her usual warmth, but every time the little girl smiled up at her, Freya's heart ached with shame. Leo, on the other hand, didn't share the same hesitation. His gaze was unrelenting, his presence always lingering. Freya couldn't ignore the subtle ways he sought her attention, standing too close, brushing against her arm, finding excuses to be alone with her. It terrified her how easily she gave in, how desperately she clung to the fleeting moments of intimacy that filled the void Ethan had left. But the moments came at a cost. The tension in the house grew thick, like a string pulled too tight, ready to snap. Freya found herself paranoid, constantly looking over her shoulder, wondering if Ethan or Lily had noticed the change. Every time Ethan stayed late at work, every time Lily spent the night at a friend's house, Freya felt both relief and dread. Relief for the secrecy it allowed her, and dread for the consequences she knew were inevitable. One evening, the storm broke. Ethan came home earlier than expected. Freya had been in the living room with Leo, their conversation low and intimate. The sound of the door opening jolted them both, and Freya shot up from the couch, her face pale. Ethan stepped into the room, his eyes narrowing as he looked between them. "What's going on?" he asked, his tone casual but laced with suspicion. "Nothing," Freya said quickly, too quickly. "We were just talking." Ethan didn't reply immediately. He glanced at Leo, who avoided his gaze, then back at Freya. The tension in the room was palpable, and for a moment, Freya thought he might say something, might push further. But instead, he sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I'm going to bed," he said, his voice tired. "Long day." Freya exhaled shakily as Ethan left the room, but the reprieve was short-lived. That night, as she lay in bed next to him, the reality of what she'd done pressed down on her like a weight. She glanced at Ethan, his face peaceful in sleep, and felt a pang of guilt so sharp it left her breathless. She had betrayed him in the worst possible way, and no amount of justification could change that. The next morning, Ethan seemed distant, as though he sensed something was off but couldn't quite place it. Freya did her best to act normal, but her nerves were frayed. She avoided Leo all day, determined to put distance between them. But as evening fell, she found herself alone in the kitchen once again, and it didn't take long for Leo to find her. "Mom," he said softly, stepping into the room. His voice was filled with the same longing that had haunted her since that day at the beach. "Leo, please," she said, her back to him as she washed dishes. "We can't keep doing this." "But I love you," he said, his words cutting through her like a knife. "And I think you love me too." Freya turned around, her eyes filled with tears. "It doesn't matter," she said, her voice shaking. "What we're doing is wrong. It's destroying everything." Leo stepped closer, his expression pained. "I don't care," he said. "I don't care about anything else as long as I have you." Freya's resolve crumbled in that moment. She reached out, pulling him into an embrace, her tears soaking into his shirt. "This can't last," she whispered. "You know it can't." But even as she said the words, she knew they meant nothing. She had lost control of the situation, and the consequences were closing in. In the days that followed, the cracks in their family grew more apparent. Ethan began to notice the tension, though he didn't voice his suspicions outright. Lily, too young to understand, sensed the unease and became more withdrawn. Freya felt like she was living in a pressure cooker, waiting for the inevitable explosion. It came one night when Ethan arrived home early again. Freya was in the kitchen with Leo, their conversation too close, their body language too familiar. Ethan walked in, his face hardening as he took in the scene. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his voice sharp. Freya froze, her heart pounding. "Nothing," she said, but the quiver in her voice betrayed her. Ethan's eyes narrowed as he looked between them. "Don't lie to me, Freya," he said. "I'm not stupid." The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Freya opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. She could see the realization dawning in Ethan's eyes, the pieces falling into place. "I don't believe this," he said finally, his voice breaking. "I don't believe you'd do this to me, to us." The confrontation shattered whatever fragile balance had been holding their family together. Ethan's anger was like a wildfire, consuming everything in its path. Freya could only watch as the life they had built together crumbled around her, knowing she had no one to blame but herself. The days after Ethan's discovery were a blur of chaos and confrontation. Freya tried to explain herself, but every word felt hollow, every excuse a thin veil over an unforgivable betrayal. Ethan wouldn't listen. His rage was volcanic, his trust shattered beyond repair. He packed a bag that night and left without saying where he was going, slamming the door behind him. Lily, too young to understand the details, sensed the tension and cried herself to sleep. Freya sat beside her daughter's bed, stroking her hair, but her mind was elsewhere. On Ethan, on Leo, on the wreckage she had created. Leo, for his part, seemed conflicted. He tried to comfort Freya, but his attempts only deepened her guilt. "This isn't your fault," he said one night, his voice low and earnest. "We're in this together." But Freya couldn't accept that. "No," she said, shaking her head. "This is my fault. I let this happen. I should have stopped it before it ever began." For the first time, Leo looked at her with something other than longing. There was a hint of fear, a realization of the consequences that stretched far beyond their private moments. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice trembling. Freya didn't have an answer. All she knew was that their lives would never be the same. The fallout was swift and merciless. Ethan filed for divorce within days, citing irreconcilable differences. He refused to speak to Freya, communicating only through lawyers. He demanded custody of Lily, claiming that Freya's judgment was compromised. The thought of losing her daughter was almost too much to bear, but Freya knew she had little ground to stand on. The community, once warm and supportive, turned cold as whispers spread. Friends avoided her calls. Neighbors looked away when they saw her on the street. Freya felt like a pariah, trapped in a prison of her own making. Through it all, she tried to make sense of what had happened. She had been lonely, neglected, and desperate for connection, but those feelings didn't excuse her actions. She had crossed a line that should never have been crossed, and now she was paying the price. One evening, as the sun set and the house grew quiet, Freya sat alone in the living room, staring at the empty space where Ethan's favorite chair used to be. She thought about the life they had built, the dreams they had shared, and how she had destroyed it all in a moment of weakness. She knew she couldn't undo the past, but she could try to learn from it. She began seeing a therapist, determined to understand the choices she had made and the pain she had caused. The sessions were brutal, forcing her to confront the darkest parts of herself, but they were also cathartic. For the first time in years, Freya began to see a glimmer of hope, a path to redemption. Leo moved out shortly after his 18th birthday, leaving behind a note that simply read, "I'll always love you, but I need to figure out who I am." Freya cried for hours after reading it, torn between relief and heartbreak. She knew it was for the best, but the void he left behind was another reminder of all she had lost. Months turned into years, and slowly, Freya began to rebuild her life. She found a job at a local bookstore, a small but meaningful step toward independence. She attended support groups, connecting with others who had faced their own moments of reckoning. And she worked tirelessly to repair her relationship with Lily, who was now old enough to ask questions about the past. Freya didn't have all the answers, but she tried to be honest. "I made mistakes," she told Lily one evening as they sat together on the couch. "Big ones. But I'm trying to be better. For you. For us." In time, the wounds began to heal, though the scars remained. Freya knew she would carry the weight of her choices for the rest of her life, but she also knew she had the strength to move forward. The experience taught her a painful but invaluable lesson. Loneliness is powerful, but it's not an excuse to cross boundaries or betray trust. She learned that love, real love, is built on honesty, respect, and selflessness, not on fleeting moments of desire. As Freya closed her eyes that night, she made a silent vow: to face the future with courage, to own her mistakes, and to never again let her loneliness lead her astray. If you've ever faced a moment where your choices led you down a dark path, what did you learn? Share your story in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that explore life's toughest lessons. And stay tuned for the next one. It's a tale of betrayal you won't believe. Together, let's uncover the truths that shape us.